The David Bohm Society presents.
Well, I think we'll make one more and try to go a little further ahead on this discussion. See, we were saying that the thought now has concepts, it's an abstraction, it's limited, and so on. And these concepts have a name, and the name calls it up, and it all goes into play, and so on. Now, I think we can get a further insight into why this concept has such a powerful effect. If we consider the fact that thought is able to provide a representation of what we experience. That is, the word representation is a very good word because it just says to represent, to present again, right? So let us say perception presents whatever is presented in perception, and our thought represents it in abstraction, right? A map is a kind of representation. The map is not obviously much less than the territory, but this abstraction is advantageous because it focuses on what may be important for our purposes, with all the unnecessary detail left out. It shows also it's organized. It's structured and organized in a way which may be helpful, right? And may be relevant. And so, therefore, a representation is something not just a concept, but it's a number of concepts really together to form. You see, an extreme case of the representation, the scientific representation of the world in physics. The whole mass of concepts is involved there. And you have, just simply when I talk, you can form a representation, of what it forms a representation of whatever I mean. And there are countless examples of that kind. You see that we are forming representations, right? And thought gives rise to these representations which guide us, which are abstract, right? And partial. They aren't limited. Now, you see, but this subject of representation is quite subtle because, of course, if you close your eyes and I describe something, some sort of representation will form in your mind, in the imagination, right, perhaps, as if it were perceived. It will not be the same as the thing. It will be very abstract compared with it. It will highlight certain points which may be of interest compared with the perception, and so on. But now the thing to notice is something, the key point, that this representation is present not only in thought or in imagination, but it fuses with the actual perception and experience. Right? That it is, in other words, the representation fuses with the presentation. So that what is presented is already a large part of a representation, so it presents it again. The representation is representing representation, right? As well as some perception. It's representing a net result of perception and representation. So you see, as you think about it, you keep on thinking about the presentation, which includes the previous representation. See, the way you experience something depends on how we represent it or misrepresent it. You see, a salesman may misrepresent an object, and you will see it wrongly and buy it, right? We won't want it. It's very important, you see, that things be as represented. Right? That's part of the question of truth, right? And this, you can see, this is a serious question. This, see, just simply by naming something, you can suddenly become intensely aware of it in your perception, right? Whereas you hadn't noticed it before. It calls attention, right? You see, also a representation. You see, if you represent yourself to yourself as noble and good and capable and honest and everything that's right, and that representation enters the perception of yourself, right? That's how you perceive yourself, right? Now, somebody else gives another representation, you see, which is, dishonest, stupid, huh? You see, and that sort of goes in too and is perceived. Now that shakes up, as I said before, that shakes up the whole system, the whole neurophysiological system, right? And becomes very disturbing, and therefore there is an effort to represent it in a better light. For thought is under pressure to represent the situation in a better light, more favorable light. And there you see the beginning of self-deception, right? You see, now this happens all the time, you see, with your country, with your religion, and so on. You see, the country is represented as right, good people. The enemy is the opposite, is represented as the opposite, right? And it's therefore presented that way. Now, we do not notice the connection between representation and presentation, the two-way connection, right? You see, thought seems to lack the ability to see that this is happening. It's all unconscious. It must be implicit, right? Or something. Yes, so see, we're not saying this process is bad or good, but what's wrong with it is not that it takes place, but rather we are not aware of it. And therefore we can become caught up in all sorts of confusion and self-deception. You see, now we couldn't do without it. You see, in order to take action towards something, it's not enough to represent it in imagination or thought. You must actually feel it to be there. You see, so if you say you're focusing your attention on something to do, like if we say this is a rose, that's a representation, right? It's also a lot of other things. It's a living plant, it's a texture, it's a color. You see, by calling it a rose, you present it in a certain way to yourself. By saying, that somebody is American, that's a or English or whatever, that's a representation. You see, by saying this is a house, that's a representation, because you could say, well, it's a material structure. It could be all sorts of things. It could be represented differently. You see, like, take a forest, it could be represented as a source of lumber, and the lumberman would then perceive it, would be presented to him that way. To the artist, it could be represented as something worth painting, right? And then to a fellow who wants to take a walk, it would be represented as a place he could enjoy himself walking along the path. You see, and there are countless representations of the forest, which will present the forest in a different way and will call attention in a different way, you see. The awareness and attention are directed by the presentation, right? They may be limited. Since the representation is limited, the presentation is limited, right? And therefore, if it holds your attention is limited, right? And therefore, that's as much as you can see.
dbohm.com